Good morning, everyone. My name is Katherine Duffy. I am the Director of Professional Development here at SAES, and we are so honored to have you here for this conversation around difficult conversations. This is a topic, Rob, that everyone, all of us, always need every day for all of our lives. And so I don't think this can ever be a topic that goes out of style, sadly. So I'm honored that everyone's here. I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Rob Devlin, who will be helping on this call, and a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. We'd love to have you in. This is a meeting, so we're going to probably if you have a long question and we can't figure it out through the chat, then you can unmute and we'll get you to ask it. If you do have questions, we'd love for you to put it in the chat. Have some conversation in the chat if there are things that come up that you feel like you could contribute. And then at the end, we will answer any questions that we see fit. So this is being recorded for those who could not be here live today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Did you want to say something, Rob, real quick? Okay, you got to unmute. We got to get you unmuted.
So it brings up a couple interesting points since we're recording this, Mary Catherine. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. Just a couple of quick things, right? Number one, since we are recording, many of you may have come with some difficult conversations in mind already, but know that there's portions of this that are being recorded. And so as you put stuff into the chat and those kinds of things, just know that we'll turn off the recording at some point and maybe get into some details if you want to talk about some specifics. But just know that as we're being recorded, if there's some particulars that may be a little bit sensitive in your environment, then probably we don't want to have that as part of the recording part of it, just FYI. And then just a standard disclaimer for the association that the information that we're going to provide for you here is not intended to constitute any kind of legal advice, and that all information, all the content and the materials that we reference are for general informational purposes only. So there's your standard disclaimer. Mary Catherine, back to you.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here, and let's see here. I want to make sure you guys can see that. Can y'all see that? Strategies for navigating difficult conversations. All right, so I have done this. I actually did this topic, a breakout session on this topic years ago at a biennial that Connie Wooten asked me to do. So this is how long ago I started this. And it was, I think, just probably God laughing, because it was the time in which I needed to have some pretty significant, difficult conversations. And so I feel like that maybe that was my way of working through all of that. And so I hope that what we do today is to share some strategies, some ideas for navigating what we all have to do on a regular basis, whether it's a conversation with a faculty member or a parent or whatever. We all have to do it. So this topic began in my life, probably the year of 2002, when I was hired as a head of school. And so I love this, because this is what we all look like often when we have to have a difficult conversation, when we have to have some conversations that we know either are going to make us feel stressed or make another person feel stressed. And so I would just love for you to put in the chat to begin with, what are some things in your schools, not in particular, not in specific, but some relationships that are rich soil for difficult conversations. I know that I have some of my ideas, but I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts real quickly on what that looks like for you, what you're thinking.
And Mary Catherine, I'm glad you asked that question, because I noticed I'm seeing the folks on the call, and I see board chairs, I see heads of school, I see other people in organizations, and I think all of us come at this question and this challenge from a different perspective. And so I think that'll be helpful for us to understand kind of where you're coming from in your own particular environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see on here parents for sure, staff members, teachers, administrators, parents, teacher, head of school, parents seems to be a pretty big topic. I think it's interesting, Rob, that you said that about board members. I think sometimes we forget that board chairs especially have some of those, have opportunities for difficult conversations, because they're the ones that have to, I don't like to use the word discipline. That feels a little bit strong, but they're the disciplinarian of the board to some extent, where you might have to have a conversation with another board member that's out of line, or you may have to have a hard conversation with their head of school or somebody like that. And so, yeah, these are all rich soil for conversation, that we're all in the middle of. So here's some thoughts that I had around situations that might require a difficult conversation. Obviously, these are things that I endured as a head of school, and I'm sure that you can come up with even more. A student that fails because of an attitude problem. That would be a conversation you might have to have with the student. It might be a conversation you have to have with the parent. Teachers that suspect a learning issue. So I saw this all the time, where my faculty member might suspect there's a problem. And it was just such a challenge for them to be able to sit down with a parent and say, this is what I see, this is what I'm worried about. A parent that's angry with a teacher. So that could be a teacher that has that difficult conversation. That could be a head of school or a division head that's having to navigate that. An administrator giving a difficult performance evaluation. Having to sit down with a teacher that you know is not meeting expectation. A board member that may be overstepping his or her boundaries. These are just I'm sure a small handful. Rob, or anything that we're missing on this list?
Well, I think in today's culture and climate, also the difficult conversations around, when some of the political stuff creeps into our communities, that those can lead to some difficult conversations as well. And how do we manage or how do we lead through when people have very strong political or cultural feelings around a particular issue, and the divisiveness that occurs because of that. I think as I visit schools all across our association, I'm seeing a lot of those challenges as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So here are some strategies that commonly are used, but I have found do not work. And I will admit wholeheartedly that these are all strategies that I used, and that's how I know they don't work. The first one is to deny the problem, just pretend it doesn't exist. Wouldn't that be awesome if we could just pretend everything that's hard we don't have to do, or just deny that it's an issue? Sarcasm, shame, bribery, subtle hints. My favorite is the group rules or discussion. That's one of the things that I've learned early on, is I would send out a group email about an issue that really only applied to one person. And what happens in that scenario is that the rule followers, the people who are actually not doing that, they're the ones that get mad and say, I'm doing that. Why did you, that's not a problem for me. Why are you addressing me with this? And the ones who needed to hear it think that it's not addressed to them. And it's just humorous, because it's like you make everybody mad except for the people that need to be mad or need to be talked to. So I think all of these are strategies that we've all used at one time or another, but in my experience, they don't work.
And I think, Mary Katherine, I think those are great. When you talk about denial, I think people might not deny the issue, but they may want to avoid it because they're conflict averse. So the avoidance piece.
Oh, sorry, hang on. I didn't mean to do that.
It's all right.
I'm in a concrete maze.
All right, there we go. Go ahead and say that again, Rob.
Well, so I think denial sometimes is one way. We pretend like it doesn't exist. And I think other times we know it exists, but we just avoid it. And we use the hope strategy that it'll go away. And then the group rules of discussion, I think that manifests itself exactly how you described, where we tend to have the mistake of thinking that we're addressing the issue through email or through a text or some sort of non-face-to-face communication. And again, that's a strategy that almost always sets you up for failure. Is using non-personal ways to communicate that, a letter or an email. And so I just wanted to mention those two things that
for sure,
to avoid as well.
So this next slide is a TED Talk that we're going to watch about 5 minutes of it, and I love it because this guy really I'm going to encourage you to watch the whole thing at some point, but we're only going to watch the first 5 minutes. But this guy really talks about three ways in which we can address harder conversations, and then we're going to kind of break those down. So let's go to that and let's get that started. Can I hear it okay?
I'm in a concrete maze the size of 72 football fields. I'm being led from checkpoint to checkpoint, and before each door opens, the door behind me slams shut. The lock echoes while I'm searched and interviewed again. It's a maximum security jail, the largest in the country, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, Illinois. I'm here for the meeting, I say again, repeat my credentials. It's my first time visiting a jail, and everyone can tell. They take my phone, they take my keys, and they take my little bag of almonds. Almonds. Finally, I'm left in a room with two men who stare at me as I enter. One is a gang leader, the other is a corrections officer, and each of them is the size of 4 of me, which basically means I'm outnumbered 8-1. Their arms are strapped across their chests, flashes of anger in their eyes. I'm terrified, and I'm thinking they were worried about my almonds? The heavy door behind me slams shut. It's just the 3 of us now. No one moves. Now, who's had the very same experience? But whether you're a C-level executive or a spouse or you're a part of any kind of team, you probably know this to be true, that one conversation can change everything. So I want you to think of a tough conversation that people around you need to have. You got it? There's some issue that's holding them back from accomplishing what they want to accomplish. I believe they might be one conversation away from accomplishing that thing, but they're not having the conversation they need to have, or they've tried and it hasn't gone well. I've led some pretty tough conversations in some pretty tough environments. Northern Ireland, the Middle East, corporate boardrooms. I actually have a PhD in leading difficult conversations, and here's what I've learned. We're not having the conversations we need to have, and that's mostly because we're afraid. We don't want to make things worse. But not having these conversations, or having them poorly, is really bad. And most of us know this from our work. Some issue arises for a team. It could be a minor issue, but it goes unaddressed. Frustration sets in. Communication constricts. Tensions rise. Trust evaporates. And collaboration is done. Remember, we're talking about teams that perform surgeries, land planes, run schools. Many of us are a part of teams that perform crucial functions. We can't afford to avoid tough conversations. So that conversation that you thought of, that people around you need to have, you can lead that conversation. And I'm going to give you 3 simple rules to being vastly more effective in leading it. Wherever you use these rules, at work, at home, people are going to thank you. And then they'll start reaching goals they couldn't reach before, and they will come and find you and thank you again. And you'll benefit because the people around you will be more successful, not miserable, which makes your life better. So, the 3 rules. Rule number 1, move toward the conflict. Most of us don't like conflict, but it's normal, healthy, and totally human. Without conflict, problems hide everywhere. Big problems, problems we all want to solve. So, conflict is information. And handled well, conflict is opportunity. So rather than running from it or pretending it's not there, move toward it. More on this in a minute. But rule number 2, you don't know anything. And even if you do, pretend you don't. Ask questions about people's experiences and listen to what they say. Important things will be said because you're there listening, and the better you listen, the better the people having the conversation will listen to each other. And finally, rule 3, keep quiet. Don't panic in the few seconds it takes for people to respond. They just need time. If you're jumpy about pauses, they'll see that and lose confidence in the conversation. Some of the best breakthroughs I've seen in really difficult conversations have emerged out of a brief period of silence. Don't rush in to rescue everyone from that awkward moment. It's your job to show them that moment is okay.
Okay, so I love that. And there's a lot more to this video. And I didn't want to spend the whole time of us talking about it, but I do encourage you to watch the whole video, because he talks about in the remaining part of the video what he actually was in that jail for and how it resolved. It's really cool. But I want to talk about the 3 rules, because for me, the 3 rules were super effective and super helpful in thinking about my own difficult conversations. And if you guys were at NAES last week and you went to the Eucharist, you heard Bishop David Madison preach. And one of the things he used the reference, what cows versus buffalo do in a storm. And then I think this guy actually does this as well, but this idea of moving toward conflict or moving toward the storm. I love that. I love acting as if you don't know anything, even if you do. And I love keeping quiet. I can assure you that's something that's still hard for me. It was harder for me probably 15 years ago than it is today, but it's still hard. So these are our 3 rules, and I'd like to break those down a little bit more and talk about them. So I think the first one is this idea of moving toward conflict. And, this is not our natural thing. This isn't the nature of what we do. As David said in we're cows. We want to run away from the conflict, right? I guess I shouldn't say we're cows, but we are. It's not most people's nature to run towards conflict or run towards difficulty. But if you think about these 2 things, these 2 bullet points, it makes it easier, in my opinion, to do that. And the first is to think of conflict as information. My husband is a real estate appraiser, and he's very logical and unemotional about most things. And he always says that news is just news. I'll say, well, what did you find out? He goes, well, it's this. And I'm like, well, what do you think about that? He said, it's just news. I don't have a thought about it either way. It's just information. And I think when you are able to look at conflict as information and the emotion is not there, it's easier. And again, if handled well, conflict is opportunity. For me, my experience has been that when it was handled well, we all grew from it. We all became better communicators from it. We all became better leaders from it. We learned. And so I think both of these bullet points make it, if you think of them this way, it makes it easier to move towards the conflict. Rob, what are your thoughts on these 2 thoughts?
Well, I think all of us as leaders understand that if we can reframe the challenge that we're in positive terms, then certainly we're much more willing and equipped to manage them. And so I think reframing conflict as information and reframing conflict as opportunity is an important first step. And if we think of it as information and opportunity, we're much more likely to face it head on and to move towards that conflict, as Adar suggests.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so rule number 2. Act as if you don't know anything, even if you do. I really would have benefited from this, I think, as a head of school, if I had seen this 4 or 5 years ago, because what we naturally do as a head of school is we go, or a board chair or a leader, is if we know about something, we're automatically thinking, this is how it needs to be resolved, or this is how I can fix this, or whatever. We're fixers, right? But this idea of acting as if you don't know anything, and you go into a situation asking questions, being curious, listening to people's experiences and what they're saying, resisting the urge to offer advice. That's super hard for us as leaders, especially this idea of autobiographical listening. That's the idea that we listen to with our own perspective or our own lens. and we bring our own self into that rather than listening to understand another person. And that's a hard skill. I'm not going to begin to act like this is easy stuff, but if you can master this rule, I just think it would be incredible. I think that you would be much closer to being able to have conversations in a healthy way. Rob, any thoughts on this rule?
Well, I'm going to resist the urge to offer advice and commentary here.
There you go. I like that. Well done. Well done. Final rule, keep quiet. Again, this is similar to rule number 2. Don't pretend to know the answer. Don't be afraid of the silence. Yeah, I like that part about at the end where he talked about that silence is really hard for people, for most people. It's not hard for everybody, but it is definitely hard for many of us. And I think it's hard often when you have leaders that are trying to resolve issues, and we've got lots on our plate, and it's hard to be quiet and be still and listen to the silence. But I do think it can lead people to speak up. I think one of the things that I teach in Enneagram training is that there are a couple of numbers on the Enneagram that are not going to offer their thoughts without it takes them a while to offer the thought, and they're not going to offer it if there's other people talking, and they have to have the silence in order to speak up. And this second bullet point about, being able to lead people to speak up, I think is really crucial. And then this idea of not rescuing people from the awkward moment, it's super hard, right? It's super hard to just be quiet and let people sit in an awkward silence. So I'm gonna stop right there, and I just would love to hear some feedback before we go to other strategies on what people think about what jumps out at you about these particular rules. Did anybody have thoughts that they want to unmute and mention, or anything that stands out at them that jumped out at you? Nobody?
Yep.
I had a situation the other day where I did some of this accidentally, and it was really helpful.
So say more about that. What did you do accidentally?
Well, I shut up and just let the parent talk. And I guess I normally don't do that because it felt really weird. And he gave me a lot of information that was very helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I also think I have tried to change my approach in conversations to more of this type of approach. And I ask parents, so I had a very difficult situation. What outcome would you like to have? What do you see the outcome being? Giving them the opportunity to problem solve, because they come with a problem. They don't often come with a solution. Or same with teachers, or even with myself. I've got an issue this morning that I need to deal with, and it's kind of my problem, but how do I'm trying to look for ways to ask them, what do you, here's an issue I see, what do you see that could help us or be a solution? But asking them that question, especially when they come to you with a problem, what is it that you want to see in the outcome?
Yeah. And I do think that, and that speaks to the question, the thing about not, walking into a situation, even if you think you know what the situation is, pretending that you don't, because then it just gives you, it gives you the chance to listen with open ears and an open mind. And I like that. So I want to give us plenty of time to have some conversation that's fruitful off of the recording. So let's go to some other strategies that you might consider. And these are strategies that I've put together that have meant something to me as I have walked through some difficult conversations. The first one is to prepare yourself emotionally. I don't think anybody that is ever in a school as a head, as a division head, as a board chair, rarely do we have people in situations where there's no emotion. almost always there's going to be some emotion in a difficult conversation. And so I encourage people to prepare themselves emotionally by asking themselves some questions. What's happening here? How am I feeling about it? What's the emotion that it brings up in me? Where do I fit into the situation? Just just kind of preparing yourself before you have the conversation to check yourself about where you are emotionally. If you don't do that, then things can bubble up very quickly. You can get mad. Somebody, when angry parents come into our office, if we're unprepared and we're emotional too, it makes for a firestorm. And so preparing yourself emotionally, I think, is really important. I think showing empathy and compassion is critical. What are the unspoken messages that your words are giving? Listening to understand, seeking to understand another person's perspective, validating their feelings about it. One of the areas that I really struggled with in the beginning, I hope that it wasn't just me, I'm sure other people have struggled with this too, is this defensiveness. We spend so much time at our schools, so much time and energy and emotion that we put into our schools, that it's very hard when someone criticizes your school to not be defensive, to not take that personally. And I remember somebody saying it's not personal, and me thinking, well, that's dumb. Of course it's personal. I'm here 9-10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Yes, it's personal. But the reality is that if you can remember that it's not, and avoid being defensive, it's going to go a lot longer. It's going to go a lot further, and you're going to find ways to collaborate and show sympathy and empathy and compassion. Brene Brown says clear is kind and unclear is unkind. And this is one of the most transformative things she's ever said, in my opinion. Realizing that going back to that idea of denial, Rob, or pretending it doesn't exist, holding someone to an expectation that we never actually gave them is really not kind. And we think we're being kind because we're not saying anything and we're not addressing it, but really it's unkind. Rob, do you have thoughts on this quote?
Absolutely, 100% agree. And I go back to something that Dr. Cohen said in the video, that we don't address the conflict because again, maybe we think it's out of kindness, or we think we're doing some people a favor. He mentioned that we don't address the conflict sometimes because we're afraid, is what he said, right? Dr. Cohen said that. And I wonder, that those competing twin evils of fear and pride, I think, are what sometimes prevent us from really just stepping aside and being curious and willing to listen and understand. And I wonder if, when he talks about pretending to not know all the answers, it seems my initial reaction is that seems a little disingenuous. Why are we pretending? Why are we not being candid and truthful here? But I think really, perhaps what he's suggesting is that we're not being inauthentic in this pretending, but we're realizing that we don't know, that we're willing to check that fear and that pride that entangles us at the door, and really just come into it with an open heart, open mind that says we don't know. And what we think we know may be totally wrong, or we might not fully appreciate the other person's perspective. And so then we can then pretend, if you will, not to know, because truly we don't. We're not in their shoes. And so
I agree. I think if we think back on how many times we really went into a meeting thinking we knew, and we don't, and we walk out going, oh, wow, that's not at all what I thought the situation was. So yeah, I love that. So another important thing I think in this idea of having hard conversations is around building relationships. When you earn the right to be heard, it is much easier to have conversations that are difficult. I love John Maxwell's quote, earn the right to be heard by listening to others, seek to understand a situation before making judgments about it. So taking the time to build relationship with all stakeholders, understanding that anger and frustration are almost always rooted in fear, And hearing bad news from someone is easier when they know you care about them. And one of the things that we used to say to our teachers all the time is when you have a conversation with a parent that's difficult, if you have spent time building that relationship from the beginning of school, and those parents know that you love their kid, they can hear that from you. It's when you haven't taken the time to build the relationship that it makes it more difficult. And I think that's true as a head of school with your parents or a division head. I think it's most definitely true as a leader when you're building relationships with teachers and faculty members, that you have built relationships with them and they know you care about them. Then when you have to have a hard conversation, it's much easier and they can receive it. I'm not saying it'll be perfect. I'm just saying it'll be easier. This is a particular frustration of mine, this idea of having conversations other than with your mouth. Often people think that, and especially in this day and age, I hate to date myself, but the reality is that texts and emails were not a thing, really, when I was growing up. And now it's like, this is how we communicate, and they can be misread. They can be misunderstood. They can also be screenshotted and shared and posted and altered. So my encouragement to you is when there is a difficult conversation to have, that you have it face to face, and that you don't try to do it any other way, because people can't read body language in an email.
I just want to quickly acknowledge, Joel, you have a great point, and we're going to get to that. And I'm going to ask you to speak more about your question that you have in the chat, but I think that's a good one for us to get. And so when we get to the question and answer point, we'll circle back to that. Is that cool, Joel?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Don't climb the ladder of inference. Scott Brown talks about this all the time when he talks about the drama triangle. When you climb the ladder of inference, what you do is you take in information and you interpret it on your own experiences. You draw conclusions, and then you look for signs to reinforce your story. It's projection. And I encourage you, and this kind of goes back, Rob, to what we just talked about maybe you don't know the whole thing. And so going into a situation with just open expectations and open hands and going, tell me what you're thinking. That's a much better way than to go into a situation where you've already decided how you think it's going to be. Stay healthy. This is my last one, and then we can kind of stop the video and start talking. You guys, I don't think that anybody can do the hard work that we do when we're tired, when we're stressed, when we've got lots on our plate that we're trying to walk through. And so I encourage you to remember that it's easier to have good conversation, even when they're difficult, when you have a healthy mind, when you've gotten plenty of rest and you feel good, and of course, a healthy spirit, lots and lots of prayer. And I encourage you also to always find somebody that you can talk through. If you've got a difficult conversation that you have to have, that you find somebody that you can kind of talk through. This is what I'm thinking. This is how I think it will, what I'd like to say. This is the situation. And just get it's got to be somebody that you trust implicitly, of course, but somebody that you can talk through that issue with and get it right in your mind before you go into it. And that's always helpful. Rob, did you tend to do that with conversations that were super hard, and who did you do it with?
Yeah, so I made mistakes on both sides of this, right? Just some of the biggest missteps that I've made in my life have been when I've been at a point of exhaustion or frustration, and I decided then at that point to take particular action or address things in ways that probably weren't wise, because I wasn't in a good state of mind or a good state of of rest and health. And so I've certainly made those mistakes, and I've also made mistakes by thinking I can shoulder all that myself, right? And this is mine to take care of. I'm going to come in, I'm going to solve this problem, and then we're going to move forward. And I didn't take the time. One of the things that Dr. Cohen says later on in that video is we all try to rush through this and solve the problem, but the long journey is more helpful sometimes, right? Oftentimes, that taking the time to work all the way through it and to really clean out that wound, so to speak, that long process is something that's, and I'm always guilty of taking shortcuts and trying to rush through and get on to the next thing. And I think if you can step back, find somebody that you can visit with, you know, a coach or a friend or somebody at SAES, and I've visited with a number of heads already this year that, you know, I don't have awesome answers for you, but I can listen and I can give suggestions and we can bounce ideas off of. And lots of times more and more as heads and board chairs and rectors, the situations we're facing are there certainly conflicts, but they're not problems, I think, that have easy solutions or any solutions. They're dilemmas,
Yeah.
right? And so that adds an extra degree of complexity, I think, to these things, that when we're trying to manage where there's not a clear answer, but it's a dilemma, and that we've got to really work ourselves through. You know, it's all the relationship piece. And so I totally agree. Reach out and stay healthy as much as you can, but find somebody that you can visit with. And I'm happy to serve in that capacity if that's something that you need.
Right. So I'm going to leave us with this. In your leadership sphere, what kind of difficult conversations are you thinking about? What are some of I'm sure there's not just one. And what I'd like to do now is stop the recording and maybe have some conversation around some specifics, if that's okay with y'all. So if you're watching this recording, we're thankful you came. We hope that you enjoyed it, and I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye.
And just a quick word. I mean, some of you may be willing to share some specific